After Exposure, Asbestos and Mesothelioma Stories, a podcast from the Mesothelioma Center at Asbestos.com. On this episode, we discuss the state of asbestos in schools. Your host is Kailene De Leon, Public Relations Specialist for the Mesothelioma Center at Asbestos.com.
Walter, thanks for joining us on another episode of our podcast, After Exposure, Asbestos and Mesothelioma Stories. Before we dig into today's topic, we would love to hear you introduce yourself.
Thank you, Kailene. I'm the managing editor at Asbestos.com. I've been with the company now almost 14 years. I used to be an investigative journalism for several local newspapers, and now I cover asbestos exposure and also mesothelioma diseases.
And in particular, for today's topic of asbestos in schools, I would love to hear a little bit about your experience with this topic. Have you been following this over the years?
We have. More lately in the last couple of years, we've seen a lot of schools pop up, especially in New England, New York City, and in Philadelphia, where officials have had to shut down the schools temporarily because asbestos exposure was reported. Usually happens when they're making a renovation or they had to tear down something for some other reason, or maybe even a natural disaster, and asbestos had been found in classrooms. It's often hiding behind walls, underneath floors, and especially schools there in New England, New York, and Philly are pretty old. Some of them were built in the 50s when asbestos was a common building material.
Gotcha. I was going to ask, we see these stories coming from that region quite frequently. Is there a particular reason beyond the fact that these schools are older that we see them coming from this very specific region more so than other parts of the United States?
It really is the age. I mean, I could, list some facts here about schools in that particular area. In Philly, most of the schools are over 73 years old on average. In New York City, they have more than almost 1,400 schools, and these as well are pretty old. And again, they capture that period where asbestos was used as a building material, an insulation material. In classrooms in particular, it can be found in the floor tile. It can be found in the ceiling as insulation. So yeah, these schools most generally are the ones that are found that because of the age of their school buildings.
Gotcha. And certainly for myself, and I'm sure for our listeners at home, a lot of people, and myself included, kind of see asbestos as this older problem, this 1960s, 1970s issue that to many folks in the general population, it's a problem that's already been solved. Why are we still seeing this? Why is this still a present day issue?
The main issue is that a lot of these buildings have legacy asbestos in them, meaning that if asbestos has been there and it hasn't been disturbed, it's okay to have it in the building. It doesn't pose an immediate threat. As I mentioned earlier, if these schools go under some sort of renovation, these are old schools, most likely they will be renovated. That is when the asbestos materials may get damaged. Because the asbestos is old, it does tend to become very brittle. When that happens, fibers can become airborne, and workers, staff, administration staff, teachers, students, if they're in that area, they could be exposed to that. No level of asbestos exposure is safe. So, when this sort of incident happens, it's best to alert everyone, try to keep things clean. But yeah, it's not a danger that has gone away. It's just sort of like sleeping quietly behind walls.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense. We can kind of jump into more of the regulatory background here, because you were mentioning that this is kind of a quiet danger that's lurking among us, but you don't really engage with it frequently. Something that in my kind of cursory research into this topic, I saw the Asbestos Hazard Emergency Response Act. I would love it if you could just dig into what is that and what did Congress require when it was signed into law?
Sure. Something I actually did mention in the previous question when I'm talking about the dangers of asbestos and saying that no level is safe. What a lot of people may not know are the diseases that are associated with asbestos exposure.
Mm.
The most common ones are mesothelioma, asbestos-related lung cancer, and these are two cancers, both incurable. But there are also other diseases such as asbestosis, which can be problematic, but it is treatable. So answering the question about the legislative side of this. So AHERA, which is the Asbestos Hazard Emergency Response Act. So this was passed in 1986. It requires, I'm going to read here because just want to get it right. It requires every public school district and nonprofit private school in the country to inspect for asbestos-containing materials inside the schools and develop a written management plan. This is by law. The EPA oversees that federal program, and it contains all the detailed regulations of what that program is about. That's really, in a nutshell, what AHERA stands for.
So, Walter, can you kind of explain what this law is doing in plain terms? How are we seeing this in practice in schools today?
Sure. The law has several different factors, so I'll read some of those out because they're worth mentioning. In brief, this is kind of what that law is asking schools to do. So they need to have inspections by an accredited inspector, an asbestos inspector. That reinspection has to happen every 3 years. Periodic visual surveillance, at least every 6 months, usually by trained custodians. A written management plan, and this one's really important because a lot of schools don't have any written documentation of whether they did or they didn't do an inspection. So a written management plan that's kept on file at the school and district office, available to parents and teachers at their request. Usually when you request public records, a reasonable time is about 5 days. You need to have a designated AHERA contact person, and this is someone who is very familiar with all aspects of this law and can answer questions that maybe parents have or administrators have. Annual written notices to parents, basically parents, teachers, and administrators telling them about the plan's availability for mitigating a situation. And then asbestos awareness training. And this is another key fact that a lot of school districts have been missing, because the training is not just for the AHERA contact person, but also like custodial and maintenance staff. These are usually the workers that encounter broken down things at the first instance. So they need to be very well aware of how to safely manage what they find, and more importantly, how to report it to school officials.
Okay. And when we are kind of thinking of those maintenance folks who are perhaps dealing with this asbestos hands-on, that introduces the OSHA piece to this conversation. How is OSHA kind of playing alongside the EPA when it comes to this law?
Sure. It's an interesting, they both don't run each other, but they work together with each other. So basically, OSHA regulates workplace exposure. You know, they make sure that there are permissible exposure limits, make sure that everyone's wearing protective equipment, and training for employees. The EPA portion of this, which is AHERA, is about, the building level side of safety, especially for schools. You know, the inspections, management plans, notifications. So they're complementary to each other. And you can, in fact, violate, let's say, some OSHA regulation and not violate the AHERA regulation, and vice versa. So it is a little bit complex because while they work together, they're not reliant upon each other.
Gotcha. So this sounds quite thorough, but like you mentioned right there, there could be some instances where we see gaps forming in that system. Let's kind of dig into the real world examples of this. One in particular was in New York City, with the comptroller's office releasing an audit in April of last year, kind of looking at the state of asbestos in some of these public schools. Could you talk to us a little bit about what that uncovered?
Of course. And this is when I said that, it's so important to manage this kind of situation. What happened in New York was that the comptroller's report found incredible lapses in managing the AHERA plan. So I'll read some numbers out for you so people can understand how impactful this was. So between March 2021 and March of 2024, only 257 of New York's 1,431 schools that have asbestos exposure received the required inspection. So only 18%
Wow.
got that inspection. And that's terrible news to hear because, as we know, those schools are densely populated, not just with students, but administrators as well. So about 620 of 2,000 buildings received the required inspections as well. And this is like not just schools, but other buildings in New York City as well. Overall, the Department of Education kind of failed in this respect. They failed to inspect 82% of all the schools within New York. And that is a very sobering number when you think about how densely populated those schools are.
Absolutely. And as a New York City public school student myself, it's quite a scary figure to think about. Looking at those numbers, was this a citywide failure, or did this touch a particular borough more so than the others?
So whether it's citywide or more specific to the boroughs, it's really a little bit of both. If you look at the Department of Education data, that is for all of New York, and those numbers are not great. But when you look at the specific boroughs, you'll see that some of the most populated boroughs had the least percentage of inspections. So I'll give some examples. So Brooklyn, only 13% of inspections on their schools. That's a huge gap. And that is among the worst because it has some of the schools with the most asbestos-containing materials. You look at Queens, and 16% had inspections. Manhattan, 20% had inspections. Staten Island, 21%. The Bronx, 25%. And a periodic 6-month inspection compliance followed the same report, or the same pattern, I should say, with Brooklyn, again, at the lowest at 19%.
Those are some crazy numbers, and they were just looking back at the last 3 years from that report, but there was some historical data that came out as well. Can you kind of touch on that as well?
Of course. So the Department of Education, their own records showed that since 1997, only 11% of the required triennial inspections were actually performed. Meaning this isn't just a recent lapse, it's a historic chronic issue in New York. Also, about roughly 3 decades of chronic noncompliance. That's not good. One Brooklyn elementary school reportedly hadn't had a required inspection since 2008.
That is crazy. That is insane. This audit revealed some very interesting findings. Walter, are you aware of what advocates, environmental advocates, had to say about some of the things that were found in this audit?
In fact, several climate advocates have spoken about this report and condemned the findings. I'll read a couple of quotes from 2 different organizations. The first one is from TreeAge. So they said this, and this was Shiv Sowen, the co-executive director of TreeAge. The Department of Education's failure to comply with basic asbestos safety regulations for nearly 4 decades is a disgrace and a direct threat to the health of over 1 million students and staff. We need urgent investment in building safety, along with the full implementation of Local Law 99, New York City's mandate to electrify public buildings, and a commitment to make every public school in New York safe and healthy. Time for delay is over. Another comment was from Janelle Scott, a Line Climate Director. She said this: going to school should not be a health risk. Students, teachers, and school staff deserve to breathe clean air, free of chemicals, in green and healthy schools. We join the comptroller in calling for accountability and transparency for our city agencies to deliver the safe learning environment New Yorkers need. So it's a big deal when these kind of organizations are also speaking out about these reports' findings.
This is not a isolated incident by any means. You mentioned Philadelphia earlier. What exactly happened in that city?
Yeah, in Philadelphia was a unique situation because it's one of the first times that the criminal charges were actually filed. I'll give some specifics here. So the Department of Justice charged the school district of Philadelphia. It was the first district actually in the country charged this way after a 5-year investigation. Asbestos is present in roughly 300 of the district's 399 buildings. That's obviously way more than 50%. The charges basically cited failures to conduct timely 3-year inspections of their schools.
Wow. Once again, another crazy story kind of following in suit of what happened in New York. But would you say, based off of what you've seen, are these outliers in this situation, or is this kind of a part of a bigger phenomenon that's happening nationwide?
I don't think they're outliers. In fact, going back to the question about Philadelphia, it's something I forgot to mention also. When the government inspected these schools, they found that some areas that had damaged asbestos, workers had put duct tape over it to cover it, which is not what you should do with that kind of. It requires much more mitigation than just duct tape. Um, you know, now the district is saying that they are current with compliance, but they are under an ongoing period of revisions and inspections at those schools. So speaking about, is it an outlier? I think it's an outlier in the sense that that New England area has a unique situation because of the age of their schools. Um, but if that many schools are non compliant, I haven't seen any other reports of schools in other parts of the US. So we are looking at something where it's unique to that location because of the age of the schools. But I haven't seen anything yet about other parts of the country. So I don't know necessarily if it's an outlier um, historically. Just at this moment, it seems to be the focus is there.
Gotcha. And you mentioned criminal charges. I'm sure that there were some kinds of financial fines that school districts are facing. Why now, however, they keep paying these fines, they're facing these charges. Why is this not changing school district behavior?
I think there's that old saying that the more you find someone, the more they're going to learn about not doing this bad behavior again.
Mm,
Unfortunately, the fines are not that hefty when there
mm,
are violations. So, for example, civil penalties can reach like basically $5,000 per day that they're not, the building is not under the approvals that it needs to be under, and it could be fined up to 25,000, per day for failure to keep records, all this stuff. So usually this is done very, very quickly, and the fines aren't that much. But if a fine is going to be maybe $300,000, it's still apparently not enough for a school district to clean up its act.
okay. If a superintendent or a facilities director in one of these school districts was listening to this right now, what is that first step that they could do to actually get themselves to a place of compliance?
First of all, find out, identify which schools have not been inspected.
Mm,
Second, make sure that you have all of your inspection history reconciled in one place so you can determine what needs to be the next step. You need to have a budget for, getting accredited inspectors. You need to keep the records and have them audit ready because people are going to be asking for these, and they are state records, so they need to be maintained. You make sure that all of your custodial staff has gotten the training that they have, and they have documentation they can reach out to and check whenever they need to check something again and make sure it is asbestos, for example. And basically, don't wait for an audit or the Department of Justice to come down on you and start asking questions. Districts, superintendents of those districts need to be more proactive.
mm. And on the other side of that coin, what do parents need to know? What are they actually entitled to see when they are requesting this information, and how can they go about asking for it?
And again, much like superintendents need to be proactive, parents should also be proactive about the safety of their children in schools. Because these documents are public records, parents can ask for them. So what they need to start asking is at their school district level, you know, uh, how many schools have asbestos containing materials in your district? Can I see how many times they've been inspected every 3 years? What are those inspection results? What kind of mediation has been done to fix those issues? When is the next study happening? And has anybody been injured? Or has anybody experienced actual asbestos exposure damages? These are things that are public records, and the schools should be able to provide those. Again, a reasonable time should be 5 days. But my issue with parents asking for this stuff of schools that haven't done these inspections, I don't know what kind of information they're going to get back if they don't
Mm,
get that. These are the moments where concerned parents should reach out to their Congress member and basically ask, hey, this is happening in my district. How can you help?
And for a concerned parent, they might take that step to be proactive and request this information. But are there any red flags that a parent or even a teacher might notice in the regular day-to-day inside of that school building?
Sure. Asbestos is one of these minerals that it's not easily identifiable if you don't know what you're looking for. Often it's inside other materials, let's say insulation. If you find insulation that's broken, it may look like other broken insulation, but generally speaking, asbestos was used in insulation for, let's say, walls, pipes, floors. So if you're a parent or you're, let's say, a custodial member of the school or even a teacher, if you spot something that is damaged and it looks like it's spewing out insulation, your best bet is to alert, the school officials. Do not touch it. Do not mess with it. Try to keep people away from it, because it may be simple, innocent insulation, but especially if you're in one of these old schools, there is higher risk that what you're looking at could be asbestos. Especially maintenance people who are working maybe in a school's boiler room, especially schools up north. If there is insulation that's peeling away from pipes, whether it's water heating pipes, electrical pipes, or any other type of pipe, if you see that pulling away of material, again, do not disturb it, but let someone know, because it most likely will be asbestos, especially in these old schools. So I would say those are the things that most parents, teachers, and administrators should really be looking out for.
All right. And then for those teachers or even for those maintenance and custodial staff within those buildings, you mentioned a few things in terms of how to keep an eye out for these things and what to do when they're approaching it. Is there training that currently exists for these professionals, and how would they know if they've actually received the proper training?
Staff are required to take about 2 hours of training for asbestos awareness. There are lots of different organizations that can offer that for the state. I'm sure the state has some vetted groups already that they use in schools to train their maintenance folks. Anyone who is in a position where they are more likely going to be in touch with asbestos containing materials has an additional 14 hours of training that they need on top of the other 2 weeks, or the other 2 hours, sorry. And if staff can't even do that for their maintenance workers, that in itself is already a gap of a HERA not providing that training to members of staff.
Some interesting stuff there. From a compliance standpoint, if you are that concerned parent or teacher, even maintenance professional, and you have the feeling that your district isn't doing what they're supposed to do, if there is that suspicion of non-compliance, where do you even start? Who do you talk to kind of get the ball rolling to find some answers?
Sure. A couple of places people would start with would be the district's HERA contact person, which I mentioned earlier. This person should be well-versed with a HERA and understand the specific requirements that every school must adhere to. Another one would be get in touch with the EPA listed asbestos contacts for a HERA, and these are usually statewide. So I would try that. Another one would be an EPA regional office. You could find these online as well. And in New York City in particular, you could reach out to the controller's office. That audit itself that they did, they're welcoming more information like this. And again, like I mentioned earlier, reach out to your congressional leaders and let them know what's happening, because these are people who could actually make some changes at a higher level, because they have that kind of power.
And kind of piggybacking off of that, if we do get this kind of information to that Congress member, what does that reform look like? What does meaningful change at this level kind of look like beyond what a school district or a state might do?
Several things here. Funding is a big issue. This is often the reason cited for a lack of inspections. Inspections require the hiring of very specialized experts for asbestos, and some school districts may not have that kind of money. So the first thing would be try to find dedicated funding for these kinds of programs, especially they are, state mandated. Have some real consequences for noncompliance. The fines that a lot of districts are charged are really not meaningful. So there's no pain involved here for the district to pay maybe $10,000 that they didn't respond or didn't inspect a school. There has to be real multi-million-dollar fines placed against school districts to actually adhere to these requirements. Public compliance dashboards. The schools should be able to provide parents a dashboard of what school they visited, if they were out of compliance, how they were out of compliance, what's been done, or at least a timeline of what is being done to fix that situation. And again, when you are building in schools, renovating, this all has to be involved as part of that process. So it shouldn't happen externally. And like I mentioned earlier, don't wait for the DOJ or the EPA to come down on a school district and see what's wrong. Schools need to be more proactive.
Walter, some of those red flags you mentioned, in a scenario where a teacher or a student actually sees these red flags and realizes that they may have been exposed to asbestos in a school building, what should people do? What are those next steps coming out of that?
If someone's been working in a building where asbestos has actually been identified, they need to really reach out to a doctor, especially those people who have been working in that building for decades, and they may have been exposed to asbestos over several decades. It's very important to tell your doctor, one, about the exposure, and then two, any symptoms you may be having that are tied to asbestos exposure. The most common symptoms of these are chest or abdominal pain, fatigue, fever, loss of appetite, a persistent cough, shortness of breath, swelling in the chest or the abdomen, or unexplained weight loss. While not everyone who's been exposed to asbestos will experience asbestos exposure symptoms, the likelihood of having been exposed for years makes you a very high risk. It's a high risk factor for developing one of these diseases.
And for these diseases, Walter, if you could provide some extra info, these things don't just kind of appear and show themselves overnight. The delay on developing an asbestos-related disease could take decades, right?
The issue with asbestos exposure is that the first symptoms take about 10 to after exposure for any symptoms to appear. Mm-hmm. The symptoms I mentioned earlier are also associated with common conditions like the flu, a bronchial infection, kind of like not serious respiratory infections can mimic these. But if you know that you've been exposed to asbestos or the potential of being exposed to asbestos, this is when it's highly important that you talk to your doctor and let them know about your asbestos history and the symptoms that you are experiencing. If that doctor feels you may be at high risk, you may be asked to go see a specialist.
For the folks listening or watching this podcast, if they were to take one thing from this conversation we're having right now, what would you like it to be?
I think it's a three-part, takeaway. So the first takeaway is this is not a problem of the past. Mm. Asbestos is still inside the walls of our schools, especially our older schools. Parents, administrators need to be more proactive. They need to ask more questions. Parents need to ask questions of the administrators. Administrators need to ask questions of their superintendents. And third of all, these are all public records. These should be available to parents, and parents should know their rights, that they can request access to these records. So they should not be stalled or told that we don't have those records. If they in fact do not have those records, again, that's when you should reach out to your congressperson. Mm.
Well, thank you, Walter, so much for sharing that information and joining us for this super important conversation about asbestos exposure in schools. And thank you so much to our listeners for joining us on another episode of our podcast, After Exposure, Asbestos and Mesothelioma Stories.
Thank you very much, Kailene.
Thank you.
Have you been exposed to talcum powder? You may have legal options. Contact the Mesothelioma Center at asbestos.com or call 833-628-8546 to reach one of our patient advocates today. Got an idea you think we should talk about? Or maybe you would like to join us on our podcast? Please email us at podcast@asbestos.com.